Okay, HR students, today we're going to be briefly covering Chapter 8 on training human resources. We're also going to delve into just a little bit of material from Chapter 9 about training and development and some of the differences between the two. This should not be viewed as a comprehensive lesson, but more a kind of a summary of the key points, the finer parts of training and development. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about why training is important to organizational strategy. We're going to be talking about the major categories of training and also some of the ways that we analyze how we should train, who we should train, and what means we should use to train. We're also going to be exploring, for example, when it's appropriate to do internal versus external types of training. So what is training? Training means basically we're giving people instruction to be able to perform a specific job. We're going to differentiate that from development and the idea that these are very specific things we're teaching. We're teaching people technical skills how to achieve a particular task or to perform a function. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about how we tie this into company strategy. We're talking about how we decide what kind of investments we should make. And ultimately, any of the training we're engaged in should make the organization better too, should contribute to our bottom line, make sure we're being more competitive. So in terms of investing in training, what we're looking at here is spending money to make our people better. The biggest part of any of this stuff is paying for people. Even in our world of canned content, like the lecture you're watching right now, somebody still had to be paid, namely me, to record the lecture. That being said, why is training important? Well, training makes our people better, makes them more likely to stick around because we're investing in them, and makes them potentially better at their jobs, and makes our companies able to produce things more quickly and at lower cost, and to make our customer service better. These are all things that are good for the company. So how do we tie this stuff together? Again, what we're looking at here is what is our organizational strategy? Where do we want to go? What is our strategic function? And what do we need to be able to get there? So, for example, if our organizational strategy is to make sure we're selling more product, then we need to know, for example, as part of our necessary outcomes to implement strategies, what are our gaps? Where do we need to be able to develop people to be able to get to those outcomes? And that produces what we refer to as training activities. So what you're looking at is what's your organizational priority, number one? What outcomes are we hoping to have to get that strategy? In other words, what do you have to do to make that strategy come to fruition? And finally, what kind of training do you need to provide to be able to make that happen? All of this stuff ties directly together. So in terms of our competitiveness, again, the better we are at making our organization more competitive by having better trained employees, people who know what they're doing, are up on the latest skills, or at least skills that are relevant to our strategy, the better we are. This plays a role in something we also call knowledge management. Knowledge management basically means we're keeping a catalog of what people in our company know. What certifications do they have? Does our HR department maintain a catalog of who's had what kind of training? This ultimately produces what we refer to as a learning culture. And that means over time people realize that they're never really done getting better at their jobs. We develop a culture of learning and development, and we'll talk more about development later, but that makes a more competitive organization. So there are types of training that are required. For example, if you have people who are going to be driving vehicles, we want to make sure that our managers are not engaged in discriminatory practices or sexual harassment. And some industries, for example, have mandated training. For example, people may need to know how to transport hazardous materials. Then there's other things in terms of skills that maybe our employees don't have but should have at a basic level. You literally might be training people basic language skills or basic literacy. And things like fast food, for example, there may be folks who don't have high school diplomas, who never had basic English classes, and you're teaching them basic literacy skills. There are a lot of illiterate people who are working in the United States, and these are ways we can help those folks. Then we get into technical training, people who, for example, need to know how to operate a specific piece of equipment or how to be better at customer service, how to operate a piece of equipment such as IT, information technology, or specific products. And then we also get into soft skills. This gets a little bit into development. We're teaching people how to be better communicators, how to resolve conflict, how to be better managers. That starts getting into development. So we also have a very important kind of training that happens right when you come into a company, and we call that orientation. Some people call that onboarding. Our first interactions with a company, a lot of research has shown, will affect our opinion about that company the entire time we're there. So it's a way of doing team building, getting people in for the organization, and having them really buy into our culture from day one. You guys know when you come to a university, for example, at St. Francis, we have undergraduate types of bonding activities where everybody has to get together and do team building. That's orientation. The purpose isn't just to make you have some fun, it's so that you learn how the organization works and its culture as well. So in terms of knowing what we need to be able to train, we got to think about these questions before we spend a dime on training. First is, why are we doing it? Who needs training? Why are we doing it? Are we having poor customer service returns? Are people filling out surveys that say our customer service is terrible? Well, who do we need to train to make that better? Is it just the line level workers, or is it the managers? Are the managers actually failing because they're not doing a good job training individuals? What kind of training will we give them? Is it going to be on the job? Are we going to send them somewhere else? Are we going to do it ourselves? How are we going to determine if this training makes it into the job? Are we going to evaluate if folks are actually applying what they learned when they go to work? And also, we're going to evaluate to see if we're spending money for good reasons or not. So where can we get this information? Again, some of the stuff you've already heard about. The job analysis we talked about a few chapters ago may tell us areas where people need training. We may also be able to determine, for example, from customer surveys or individual assessments. For example, if everybody in our organization's performance is not doing great, if the performance evaluations are not turning out well, it could indicate that we have a training issue. Customers could be giving us feedback as well, or even if we've got poor attitudes, for example, if we do attitude surveys or job satisfaction surveys, people are complaining about working here. Maybe they're poorly trained. And then when we also get into the idea, our efficiency levels down, we see more scrap and waste in our organization, for example. So how do we set our priorities? Well, the first is something we call a gap analysis. That means we're basically looking at where do we want to be and where are we right now. If where we want to be 10 weeks from now is everybody on our staff knows how to use a touchscreen ordering system like they do in the drive-thru at Chick-fil-A, we can easily say that our gap is right now 2 people out of 10 know how to use that, and by the end of 10 weeks, 10 out of 10 need to be able to use it. We can focus on knowledge, skills, and attitudes to it. I don't know that attitudes can necessarily be trained. I disagree with our texter that we can really develop that to any extent, but you might be able to improve them, or at least take people who are marginal and give them a little bit better of an attitude if they feel they're being invested in. In addition, things like positive mindset training sometimes can work, but we're really looking more on knowledge and skills when we start talking about training, in my opinion. So these are our 3 key aspects of these elements. The first is, again, we've talked before how there are things you can control and there's things that you can't. The learner themselves, for example, has a specific aptitude. They have a certain intellect. They have a certain ability to learn. Their motivation and self-sufficiency, for example. Some folks are so self-sufficient you can put them in front of a computer and tell them to do a training program, and you need to give them very little supervision. Some folks may not do well in an online program. Same for those of us who don't do well in online classes. What about the idea of perceived utility or value? Do they believe that this training is worthwhile? Do they think it's a waste of their time? And also, different people have learning styles such as auditory or visual learning styles. Well, in terms of the instructional strategies, how are we going to do this? Are we going to do things like practice and feedback, having people actually do the task we've trained them to do and give them feedback on it? Are we going to reinforce positive behavior? Are we going to show them the right and wrong ways to do things? And are we going to model it? In other words, are we going to train people by modeling the right behavior? And also, in terms of the training transfer between the training and putting that into practice, what about showing people why this is important, the strategic link? Are supervisors supporting people stepping away from their jobs to get training? Are people willing to be accountable for taking ownership of the information they've learned and saying, basically, I'm going to take ownership of the training material I've learned and put it into practice? That's training transfer. Internal and external are the 2 basic kinds of training. Internal basically means that we're doing things in-house. External means we're taking it out. Informal training means basically that one employee is teaching another through example, maybe informal instruction and feedback. We generically refer to this because it's called on-the-job training, or OJT. It's the most common kind, and we see it in just about every career path. And it's very necessary because there are things you can learn on the job that you'll never learn from a book. Some of the problems with it, however, for example, is that we've got folks who are doing the training who may actually are getting slowed down, may actually be getting slowed down in their day job for having to take on a training role as well. They're disrupting the regular work, so their overall production could go down. And if you get somebody who has bad habits and they're teaching new trainees all the wrong ways to do things, that gets passed on. So it's very common, it can be very useful, and it's on the surface the least expensive, but can also come with some baggage as well. So what do we do in terms of trying to do on-the-job training? What are our steps? The first is the folks who are being trained, give them a pep talk to let them know that they're expected to make mistakes, put them at ease that they're not expected to be perfect right away, and find out where they are. If you're training somebody how to use a cash register, for example, if you're training somebody to make hamburgers, find out what they've done in this regard before. Get them interested. In other words, tell them what the outcomes will be. You're going to be better at your job. You're going to be able to make more money. You're going to be able to be more efficient. Then we present the information, meaning we're showing them how the job is done, one point at a time. I don't think you can possibly be too granular. When you think you are explaining things too simply to someone in an entry-level job, that probably means you're using the correct amount of instruction. And make sure that the folks who are being trained know that this stuff is okay to make a mistake on, that you can make mistakes. You also, by the way, have to prepare the trainers as well. Give the trainees the ability to ask questions, to practice, and to evaluate themselves, for example. I think it's also good occasionally to put the trainees out, let them do things on their own and watch them from a distance. Give them follow-up feedback and not just negative feedback. Tell them what they're doing wrong and what they're doing right. In addition, give some space to the folks in your organization you're asking to do the training too, because you're making their lives more difficult. Well, and other ways we can do internal training is cross-training, meaning you have somebody who's being trained to do another job on top of what they already do. Why is this good? Well, it's good because we have more than one person who can do a given job. It makes us more redundant. If somebody calls in sick, somebody else can do the job. Some of the disadvantages are, well, again, you're disrupting normal workflow. If you're in a union environment, unions don't like this. They don't like cross-training because they like the idea of having all employees deemed heavily essential, so it's hard to get rid of individuals. So that's a reason why unions would not be in favor of it. Then we get to the idea of external training. What are some of the advantages to sending out training? Well, sometimes it's less expensive. If you're able to do canned training, for example, online training or training seminars, sometimes it is less expensive than training somebody in-house, and you're not disrupting the normal workflow. You can allow people to get out to other places and to experience training from somebody else. Some of the challenges to it, however, though, is when you're outsourcing training, the training center that you're using or the outsourced online training, for example, may not be exactly relevant to your organization. So we can do that, though. Even the government, for example, through things like the Pennsylvania Career Link provides training programs that employers can make use of, for example, to train somebody basic computer skills. And we also have what we refer to as educational assistance programs. And that means, for example, you can have an employee get a college degree or a certification, and they get to keep that as part of the resume, and the employer pays for it. So that's a form of external training as well. E-learning is something you're all very familiar with because we're all doing it these days. The idea of conducting training over the internet. That can take the form of traditional learning like what we're doing right now, simulations, the idea of playing out a simulation like a game. We also call that gamification. When we put it onto cell phones, we call it mobile learning, and we combine these kinds of training maybe with e-learning and real-time information sharing like real-time communications, and even maybe some traditional classroom interaction. That's blended learning. Anytime you're combining more than one method of learning, that's called blended. So what are the pros and the cons? The pros are if you've got self-motivated people who are interested in learning at their own pace, e-learning works great for them. It can be quickly deployed. People can train from anywhere. And in things like a COVID-19 scenario, they can train even during a pandemic. Some of the cons to this is we have a lot of folks who are not necessarily self-motivated, and this kind of training can cause a lot of anxiety to people, in particular older individuals who are not as comfortable with it, and it could also be inappropriate in certain contexts. For example, if you're getting into something that's a very kind of developmental task, something that's a little higher end, this kind of training may not be adequate. So in terms of evaluation, we can evaluate the worth of the training by asking the person who was trained, what did you think? Was it effective? Did you help you? We can actually give somebody a test to measure. What did you learn? What about behaviors? Are you doing things differently on the job? And results. Is the company more productive because you were trained? So we can measure this stuff. Why would we want to measure this? Because we're paying good money for it. So some of the other things we can do, for example, we can do what we refer to as a cost-benefit analysis or return on investment. What these basically both mean is what did you spend and what did you get out of it? If we spend $1,000 on training, but our employees are so much more productive that every month we're producing another $1,000 in profit, it has paid for itself. We don't have enough time in this lecture to explain how you might do that evaluation, but that is something we're looking at. And we also might be looking at, for example, other organizations our size. What are they spending on training versus what we're spending versus the cost of results? And we refer to that as benchmarking. So the stages in determining this stuff, first you're going to determine what the training costs. And those are direct and indirect costs, the cost of actually sending somebody to training or paying for them to go to training or paying a supervisor, for example, to do on-the-job training with somebody and not do their normal job. Then you're also looking at what can you save. If we train one person to be more effective in their job, what kind of money are we going to save? And we basically do the math. So think about what you're spending versus what you're getting in return. So what are some of the costs? Again, what we're paying somebody on the job to train somebody, paying for somebody to be away from the office, the cost of not producing things. The benefits are better production, maybe more independent employees, and the ability to use new capabilities, meaning we have folks who are trained in the newest and latest and greatest approaches. So that's training, guys. Let's talk a little bit about how development goes into this as well. Guys, the difference between training and development, training is training for individual skills and aptitudes where when we get into things like talent management and development, we're talking about growing somebody in the long term. Strategic talent management means we're trying to look at the biggest and most important strategic jobs in our company and making sure that we're growing people to go into those roles or to do better at those roles as we continue. And we refer to this generically as integrated talent management. What we're doing is essentially building all the things we're doing, training and development, to a goal that ties with the company. So when we think about human capital, especially if we're trying to keep people for any length of time, what we want to do is build bench strength. We want to build careers, not just jobs. People are going to be growing throughout their time with our company, and that we're also tying this into things like performance management, meaning we're evaluating our employees, seeing where their strengths and weaknesses are, how we can grow them and develop them into the leaders of tomorrow. That's really what we're talking about. So what is integrated talent management? This is how the whole thing works. Obviously, we've just talked about recruiting and placement earlier on, but we're doing that strategically because we're looking at people who can grow within the company. Here's where we've got some talent management ability. We just talked about training, but then we get into development. Performance appraisals come back in as well. Compensation, for example, incentivizes people. And the idea of performance management and performance appraisals mean we're growing people into these paths of career planning and succession planning. What we get out of this is a talent pool that's ready to manage our companies. So that grows us into what we refer to as succession planning. What is succession planning? What we're basically talking about is the idea of having people who are ready to step in new roles and grow within a company. It's a real mistake that companies make relying on one person too much. For example, Apple faced a real succession challenge when Steve Jobs got sick because there was nobody in the wings who was ready to be the next Steve Jobs. Companies at that point have to sometimes look externally for their next person. So it's better if you have a talent pool in-house. There's a reason why companies in the C-suite have a president and a vice president, for example, or governments for that matter. We want to have somebody ready to step in and take over. So what are the benefits? The benefits of having a succession plan is that we're giving a chance for people to move forward. We're showing people that we've got plans for them and that there's an opportunity to move up within the company. We're establishing internal leadership, and we're also getting the people who are stakeholders of the company, whether they're employees, customers, or people who are shareholders, showing that we're thinking about the future. These are all benefits for us. So as opposed to a job, a career is looking at your succession of paths through the company. Traditionally, we had this expectation that employers would develop employees. The new perspective is that employees themselves are pushing and setting some of their own direction to have a control through their career progression and path, to have some say in how they grow and develop. As a result, if you give folks the ability to have some say-so in how they grow and develop, they may make your company better in the long run. So the term development means that we're taking somebody's abilities and we're growing them. We're turning them into things that go beyond what they're currently doing. We're growing them into the executives of tomorrow. So what are the differences? Guys, basically spoken, if you're talking about training, we're talking about specific tasks and behaviors, things you need right now. And we do this based on results of things like performance reviews. Development, however, is looking in the long run about making people into conceptual thinkers, growing them in the long term. And basically, the effectiveness measure of this is determining how the company is being led. Are we maintaining or growing a competitive advantage and not just better employees? People who are developed into leaders grow companies that become competitive. So, how do we do this stuff? The first level of development really is getting into developing somebody as a supervisor. So we're talking about somebody who's growing into management. Yeah, they have to learn how to manage people. They have to learn how to manage time and how to work with employees. These are all things that can be taught somewhat linear. That stuff, however, grows into leadership. People who are going to be able to be our leaders of tomorrow. This isn't as simple as training and development. We model behavior. We coach and mentor people. If you want to know why, for example, we're so big at on mentorship at St. Francis, because that's how you grow leadership. And even executive education, this is different than training somebody how to do Excel or make a PowerPoint presentation. You're training them, developing them into strategic thinkers. So what are some of these relationships, guys? I won't read the diagram to you other than to say a manager, for example, can be mentored over time into a more experienced manager and eventually a leader. So, for example, some of these ideas of growing from a less experienced to a more experienced manager, we start with initiation, cultivation, separation, and redefinition. What this means is we're pulling somebody in a year and turning them into a quality manager. We cultivate them into a growing leader in 2 to 5 years. In separation, that means that leader becomes independent, or they may even go to another company. That could happen. You know, that could take a year or more. And then we get into the idea of redefinition. It means that we're constantly reevaluating ourselves as leaders. What I just talked to you about in 23 minutes or less is the basics of training and development. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Have a great day.